I know there will be some people trickling in. There are lots of fun events going on across town tonight. Welcome. On behalf of the University of Montana's Penetralia chapter of the Mortarboard National Honor Society, I would like to welcome all of you fine folks to hear our 2017 last lecture. I am Amanda Rose-Barsky, the 2017 last lecture co-chair and a senior in the Women's Gender and Sexuality Study program here at U of M. Mortarboard, a 99-year-old organization, counts as its highest values scholarship, leadership, and service. Chapters across the country facilitate the last lecture series, choosing one professor annually to give a public lecture as if it were their last. This year's lecturer was chosen for a multitude of reasons. Tobin Miller Shearer is a director of African American Studies and an associate professor of history here at U of M. He was voted the best professor of Missoula by the Missoula Independent in the last year. And also was awarded the 2016 Distinguished Teaching Award. For his outspoken views, some of them on unearned privilege, he was added to a conservative professor watch list as well. His latest book, 2 Weeks Every Summer, Fresh Air Children and the Problem of Race in America, was published earlier this week as well. If you brought your copies, he's signing them. At U of M, Professor Shearer fills many roles and has earned many accolades, but he is most proud of his defining roles as husband of Cheryl, father of Dylan and Zachary, and child of God. Please welcome with me, Dr. Tobin Miller Shearer.
Thank you so much. It's good to be here with you this evening. My sons and my partner keep me honest. They have for a very long time. And that was never more true than a week ago tonight. Cheryl and I were sitting at the table near the end of the fettuccine dinner that I had made, and we were sipping wine, and I asked her, "When have I screwed up?" Cheryl laughed. It's a laugh I know well, one that really doesn't require any further comment when I hear it, because it always means the same thing. Tobin, do I really need to count the ways? So I did some counting for her. I reminded her of the time that I returned from a 3-week trip to California, took responsibility for doing all the diapers for the first 24 hours, and then after hearing 18-month-old Zachary fill his drawers, turned to Cheryl and said, "It's your turn." I told her again of the time when my colleague of many years, an African-American woman, had been leading an anti-racism workshop session until someone from the group asked me a question. Within 5 minutes, I had taken over the session, and my colleague stood seething on the side. I then told Cheryl that I couldn't recall all that many other times that I had screwed up. She laughed and added, "Well, why don't you ask your sons?" Both our sons are now in their mid-20s, live in Chicago, and have a long practice of ensuring that their father's ego does not get overinflated. Zachary once crafted an entire stand-up routine at the Union Club around having grown up as the child of a white guy who does anti-racism work. It was hilarious and entirely at my expense. In our family's annual Christmas letter, the boys each year try to find ways to ensure that I remain humble. In fact, here's what Zach wrote about me one year after I had a book come out. He just had a book published, so he's going to be all like smug, smug, smug. I just got a book published. Look at me, I'm intellectual. So I texted Dylan and Zach with a certain amount of trepidation, and I'll just show you the screenshots of our exchange. So I wrote, so yet another request for a writing project, guys. I'm working on my douchebag lecture and trying to come up with anecdotes of when I've screwed up. Your mother suggested I contact you thinking that you would have plenty of examples to share. Any particular instances come to mind? Dylan writes, LOL, Vermont trip? Or are you looking for a particular kind of mess up? I reply, well, there is that Vermont debacle. I guess I was thinking more along the lines of when I acted like a douchebag, not so much as when I just was thinking I knew what I was doing on the trail. Or are they the same? I mean, emoji, emoji, emoji. So I said, my emoji illiteracy crops up here. What does that mean? LOL. I was being sarcastic, but like in a nice way, so you know I didn't really mean it. Okay, I got it. Then he writes, I honestly don't really know anything specific except for like a few times you like yelled at customer service reps over the phone. Damn, that is right. Sort of blocked that one. Thanks for bringing it up. Then I add, your mother agrees, by the way, and tells me it's an ongoing issue. LOL, yeah, thanks, Dylan. Then Zachary, our younger son, pipes in, there was that time as kids when we were playing with Jeremiah and Gio in the backyard, and you got real pissed at them because the soccer ball kept accidentally getting kicked in the flowers or something. And of course, Dylan has to put a LOL there. Double damn, also true. Plus, your mother just reminded me of the times that I would get frustrated with her when I was really worried about something else. This is proving to be a bit more of a challenge than I anticipated when I first came up with the title. Thanks, though. When we finished that exchange, I asked Cheryl, can you remind me again why I set myself up to do this lecture? In addition to laughing, this time she added, oh, Tobin. So, welcome to How to Be a White Guy, a last lecture on punching Nazis, baking pies, and how not to be a douchebag. Before going any further, I want to extend my appreciation to Amanda Rosbarski and her colleagues on the Mortarboard National Honor Society for their invitation to give this last lecture. I'm deeply honored by your trust in asking me to give this talk. And I also want to thank you all for being present tonight. It means the world. And finally, I want to again acknowledge that we are in the Aboriginal territories of the Salish and Kalispel people here this evening. One quick word of caution in case there are younger audience members that I'm not seeing at the moment. So I will, upon occasion, use some profanity tonight, so be forewarned. Upon hearing that I was giving this talk, friends and acquaintances have responded in 4 ways. They have said that I am either 1, arrogant, 2, stupid, 3, brave, or 4, insulting. I understand the reactions. The title could suggest that 1, I know everything there is to know about being a white guy, and I'm going to impart my knowledge to those white men who don't know how to be a white man very well, and hence come across as arrogant. Or 2, I don't realize just how controversial a topic this is, and therefore I'm stupid for talking about it. Or 3, white men need to be talking about something other than punching Nazis, even if having a deeper discussion about the deeper issues might draw the attention of white supremacists, and therefore I'm brave for stepping up. Or 4, white men know how to be white men. It's insulting to suggest otherwise. Or as one white guy posted in response to this lecture on Facebook, the next thing they'll be giving us is instructions on how to pee standing up and how to shave. They're all actually pretty reasonable assessments. I get them. The truth? Well, that's for you to decide by the end of the lecture. My friend Jake Hansen, an associate director of UM's Writing and Public Speaking Center, raises what is ultimately perhaps the most important point of this lecture. Jake puts it this way. How could your talk get people who aren't really worried about ideas like white privilege to start worrying about it? And then he makes an analogy. If my car gets to work and I'm not sweating global warming, you're not going to get me to think about bike commuting or buying a hybrid. They seem unnecessary and worthy of my attention. I don't think there's a problem to be solved, so I'm not interested in kicking around solutions or listening to you talk about things that help us move towards solutions. In other words, Jake's challenging me to speak to guys who don't give a flying fig about racism, sexism, classism, or heterosexism. He challenged me to find a way to say, You might not think so, white guys, but we're kind of blowing it in a number of ways. So let me start with the white guy part. The title, How to Be a White Guy, should really be phrased, How to Be a White Guy with Integrity and Poise, but the title was long enough already, and I just didn't have any additional room. My intention in this lecture is to speak to a particular kind of white guy, and so I simply want to note here that the term white guy needs a little bit of unpacking. This evening, I will be talking primarily about and to white guys who, like me, are straight and have been born into bodies that match our sense of gender and personal identity. That is, we are cisgendered. This is not to say that notions of masculinity that I'll be exploring are limited to the straight, white, cisgendered identity that I call my own. It is to say that I want you to know that I'm keenly aware that my experience is not universal. My use of the term white guy is offered with respect for and recognition of the overall fluidity of gendered identities, and to recognize that gender itself should never be placed in a binary frame. A story. I never actually had Titus Bender as a professor in college, but I heard him give a lecture upon occasion. I liked him. He reminded me of sort of an academic elf, a twinkle in his eyes, always ready to laugh, smart but not pretentious. He once invited me to give a lecture in his class, but I got the time wrong and arrived an hour late. He wasn't the least bit irritated. When I was a student, I wasn't aware of his past. I didn't know that he had spent time in the Deep South during the most contentious days of the Civil Rights Movement. I had no idea that one time an African-American couple by the names of Vincent and Rosemary Harding had agreed to meet and spend time with Titus in Meridian, Mississippi. But given the reality of the Deep South in the late 1960s, they had arranged to meet Titus at a gas station outside of town. And the plan was for Titus to start his car when he saw the Hardings approach, begin driving, and then the Hardings would follow, because this way, no one would see a white man escorting a black couple to his home. It was a sensible plan, one that would protect Titus and the Hardings from reprisal in the local community should anyone notice their contact across racial lines. What I didn't know in college was that Titus Bender had flipped the script. Even though there were plenty of witnesses at the gas station, white men who almost certainly had connections to the KKK, when Titus saw the Hardings drive up, he didn't start driving, but instead he got out of the car. And in an interview many years later, Vincent Harding described what happened next. Harding said, all kinds of white guys were sitting around the service station observing what was going on. Not only did Titus get out of the car, but in those days, the branch of the Mennonite church that he was a part of practiced what they call the kiss of brotherhood, where when you met somebody from the community, from the church, you actually embraced them and kissed cheek to cheek. Titus did this in the midst of Meridian, Mississippi. I got out, Mama got out, and Titus walked up to us and then gave me the embrace. That kind of risk-taking for what people really believed in was the kind of thing that kept us going. And then he concluded, I wish I knew what some of those guys thought was going on, but we didn't stop to ask. I didn't know that about Titus Bender when I was a student. Titus Bender knew how to be a white guy with dignity and integrity and poise. Another story. I remember the first time I met Macaulay Todd. He was sitting toward the back in my African American history course. You couldn't miss him. Macaulay Todd is a really big man. During his tenure at UM, he played guard and left tackle as well as on the special teams for the Grizz. When I saw him that first day, I remember thinking, okay, I've got a football jock in the room. I wonder how that will go. It was not a complimentary assessment. I could not have been more wrong. Not only did Macaulay go on to prove his academic chops, but he demonstrated a high degree of integrity as a white man. For his capstone paper in African American Studies, Macaulay interviewed black and white football players on the Grizz, inviting them in the process to a remarkable degree of transparency. The white players talked with him about hearing racial epithets as children, negotiating tensions about which music to play in the locker room, and their own uncertainty of how to be a white man and not be racist. The black players he interviewed discussed their discomfort with hearing white people use the N-word, their hesitancy in coming to a predominantly white institution like UM, and having to deal with animosity from Confederate flag-waving pickup drivers in the area. But what has most impressed me about what Macaulay does is how he listens. It was evident that he had built up trust with both the black and white members of his team. How otherwise would he have been able to invite them to speak with such poignancy about their experiences? One of his black teammates told him, "People often say to me something along the lines of thanks for not being about race all the time, but when they say that, I hear them say, thank you for not being black." Sharing that kind of experience across racial lines in our country today is rare. But Macaulay Todd made that happen. And he concluded his paper by saying something significant. He thanked those he had interviewed for being vulnerable and honest. I don't think Macaulay was fully aware of those same qualities he found so admirable in those he interviewed were actually the qualities that he had demonstrated himself. Macaulay Todd is a white man with integrity and poise. He knows how to listen. I'm telling these stories because I want to make it plain that I do believe it is possible to be a white guy and not be a sexist jerk, not be a douchebag, to have integrity, to have poise. As the cultural critic Bell Hooks reminds us, patriarchy has no gender, which is to say it is the problem that is the problem. The person can change. And speaking of problems, there is the problem of punching Nazis. Images like this, whether from the Indiana Jones movies or others like them, abound. They have captured the popular imagination. And I understand the attraction. There is a strong cathartic impulse bound up in the celebration of these Hollywood fantasies. To punch a Nazi is to overcome a cartoonish depiction of evil. It is to claim the righteous space of the hero, to become Indiana Jones for a moment. For some, posting and celebrating images like this are an adolescent fantasy cooked up by Hollywood to appeal to audiences not willing to look deeper at the true causes of racism, of which the Nazis, the KKK, the Aryan nations, or any of the white supremacist groups are only the symptoms. Now, to be certain, these extremist groups play an important role in legitimizing so-called more reasonable groups who support the same white supremacist agenda without the overtly offensive rhetoric. But they are not the problem. Racism is, sexism is, classism is, heterosexism is. When my friend Greg Gordon, a professor at Gonzaga over in Spokane, heard about what I was going to be discussing, he contacted me to ask if I'd like to be added to a closed Facebook group called Punching Nazis. He described it as a way to metaphorically call out neo-Nazis, not necessarily to endorse physical violence, but then added the group had taken on a life of its own. I soon realized what he meant. The page mixes videos of white supremacists getting punched, often set to music, with analysis of the Antifa movement, with discussion of the so-called alt-right, which I want to be clear in naming that the label itself attempts to normalize the groups that have coalesced around a shared doctrine of white supremacy. The page also reports on those who have, punched Nazis. But what is immediately apparent about the group is that their real interest is in celebrating and creating and idealizing that moment. It seems to suggest that the most important thing a white guy can do right now is to punch a Nazi. What I am saying is that being a white guy with integrity and poise does not have to turn on the question of whether one chooses to seek out and punch Nazis. In fact, I would argue that punching Nazis for the sake of punching Nazis plays into the sense of victimization and alienation that fuels much of the white supremacist activity in our country today. Now, I should note here that my comments critiquing the movement to punch Nazis is not a blanket dismissal of the Antifa movement. Those who have organized to oppose neo-fascists in our country have played an essential role, especially those who have adopted a disciplined ethic of armed self-defense. During a white supremacist rally in Charlottesville in August, for example, Antifa members literally saved the lives of nonviolent clergy who had gathered in silent witness against white supremacy. Likewise, it's not just white guys who punch Nazis. Women have also done so. And in a recent high-profile event in Seattle, an African-American member of the Antifa movement punched out cold a swastika-wearing Nazi who had been harassing an African-American man earlier that day. But amid these complexities, I've continued to call into question the fixation of punching Nazis, if for no other reason than I think that it detracts from the importance of long-term organizing and change efforts. Now, the topic of punching Nazis does bring up the topic of masculinity. My friend Felipe Hinojosa, professor of Chicano history at Texas A&M, told me this: white men can still play ball, be in all-male spaces, and don't have to be steeped in feminist theory. The idea is that once you can stand to not be a douchebag, then you will go out and learn about the history of feminism. But start small, he said. Start with just being cool and not always having to be in control of shit. Felipe also told me one more thing. He said, remember, Tobin, that you might be the only white male that they will ever meet that is a man in the way that you are a man. That's a big responsibility, so don't screw this up. Well, actually, he said, don't fuck this up. But I don't like to say that word, and since I'll probably say that word 3 more times, brace yourselves, I decided to say don't screw it up instead. And Felipe, if you're listening online, I'm doing my best, bro. I also said I'd talk about baking pies. Why pies? Well, the short answer is that I really like to eat them. As the students in my African American Studies classes will tell you, each semester I host a soup and pie night for all the students in my classes and in the African American Studies program. Cheryl and I open our home, and for a couple of hours, we are graced with a group of 30 to 50 students hanging out in our living room and dining room and kitchen and eating soup, but more importantly, eating pie. Lots of pie. Chocolate jalapeno pie, reverse pumpkin pie, shoe fly pie, caramel apple pie, and my specialty, peanut butter pie. I love the fact that I get to make all these pies. Now, I say this because I've learned that part of being a white guy with integrity and poise is to do my share of household tasks. Many studies have shown that women in domestic heterosexual partnerships bear a disproportionate burden of completing and organizing household tasks. It's something known as the mental load. Having to think through what needs to be purchased at the grocery store, where the bills need to be paid, who will take care of the pets while the family is on vacation, etc. Cheryl and I have worked at balancing such domestic duties during the course of our nearly 31 years together. A little bit of a contrast there, right? 31 years. Cheryl has looked way better than I have through those 31 years, but anyhow. While I was in graduate school and she was working full-time with a long commute, our sons and I did all the cooking during the week and the grocery shopping every week. I took responsibility for teaching the boys how to cook from the time they were in 3rd grade forward. Just last week, Cheryl and I sat down to check how our current arrangement of household duties is going, as she's now taking 2 classes and working 4 days a week. We made a few shifts. I expect we'll need to do more so as her schooling progresses. And I'll add a caveat here that comes to me by the way of another colleague and friend who asked that I not use her name. She cautioned against white guys thinking that, for example, cleaning out the dishwasher without being asked is a fair exchange for sexual favors. Regardless of what some magazines may say about it being a turn-on for a man to help out around the house without being prompted, taking responsibilities for doing the unenviable chores is not a tool of seduction, guys. This is the way my friend put it. I have never sworn as much in a lecture as I'm doing tonight. I just want you all to know this. I'm a little bit uncomfortable with it. My son said I got to step out in some new areas. Anyhow, this is what she said. I think that is horseshit and says something about the expectations men have about housework and its relationship to sex and gender roles. Empty the damn dishwasher because it's clean and you're standing there, not because you hope to get a pat on the back or more later on. But back to baking pies. Did I say I bake pies because I like to eat them? It's true, but I also do it because it represents for me a domestic task that I learned from my mother that is often associated with women that I can embrace and establish that this too is an expression of masculinity, of what it means to be a white guy. Then there's the question of not being a douchebag. How does that happen? Now, before I go any further, I want to acknowledge that the term douchebag as a way of describing belligerent, entitled, obnoxious white men is problematic, fraught, and debatable. One respected feminist argues that it is perfectly fine to use this insult to describe a sexist man because the term comes from a practice that is itself sexist. My friend Tamari Day, a chaplain and theologian, however, objects to the term because, and I quote, "The words have to do with women that we are dirty after our periods or sex, that we need to clean up to be acceptable again, and there's just nothing positive or healthy about it. And to take it and apply it to a man is to demean him by connecting him with something demeaning about women." She says, "It's convoluted, I know, but I just don't like it, never have, never will." Now, I've obviously chosen to use the word and am again using it here. And I'll just say that I recognize the problems with the term and share discomfort with it, but I've chosen to use it for that very reason. I want us to be even more uncomfortable about the kind of person that the term represents than we are about the term itself. Here's how the Urban Dictionary defines the term, and I promise this is the second to the last time that I'll drop F-bombs in this lecture. It says, "A douchebag is someone who has surpassed the levels of jerk and asshole, however not yet reached fucker or motherfucker." I think that sums it up. But how not to be one and to take a step toward being a white guy with integrity and poise. As my sons and partner reminded me in the text exchange I started with, I have a history of acting like a douchebag while on the phone with service personnel who usually have been women, who almost certainly were making less money than I was when I spoke with them, and who had to, I am certain, deal with sexist jerks every day. When I've acted belligerent in this way, it has invariably been in a situation where I felt like I was not being treated like a white guy should be treated. Whether it was the case of an overcharge or a mistaken utility bill, a canceled flight, or a newspaper that was not properly delivered, I got all pissy and belligerent when I felt like my privileges were threatened. That's a problem. I'm working on it. It's indicative of what is happening in our society today. My reaction, my assholery, as my brother-in-law Ed deems it, is a microcosm of what is happening among many white men. When our privilege is threatened, many of us strike back, verbally and now increasingly physically. But as I said, I am working on not acting in this way. I will not do this in the future. I have to learn how to step away from this behavior if I want to be something other than what society has taught me to be. But I haven't really addressed the issue in the title, How Not to Be a Douchebag. Again, my friend Tamari was helpful. She wrote me a list of questions that get to the root of what it means to be a white guy with integrity and poise. She asked me, how do anger and shame play into your way of being a white man? How does sexual desire or sheer horniness play into your way of being a white man? How does the desire for greater freedom and power play into your way of being a white man? Who handed you the story of how to be a man, and how does that story constrain you? Who are you scapegoating when you can't get what you want or need, and who are you projecting your unacceptable emotions and desires onto? There's a lot to explore in those questions. And we need longer conversations about anger, which, as Zen master Thich Nhat Hanh reminds us, is something worth redeeming. He says, hold on to your anger, use it as compost in your garden. We need to understand shame, which can also be understood as self-loathing, in order to find ways to fully love ourselves and others like us. We need to understand our sexual drives in order to enter into mutual, enjoyable sex lives with our partners. We need to understand how we express affection, follow models for being men, and participate or refuse to participate in scapegoating those who are different than us. But the final question she asked me, which I found the most challenging. She also asked, when and where have you learned from mistakes, and when and where and how do you think you've gotten it right, and what has happened for you and to you and through you as a result? What does real white manhood feel like to you? Can you dare the men who are listening to try it on for size? So I will answer her question as best I know how. I have learned that I need to be quiet and listen to women and members of the LGBTQ community and people of color and poor people because, in as much as they are on the margins of society, they see things that I cannot. I have learned this because there have been hundreds of times when my blinders were pointed out to me. Like the time my friend Conrad Moore, an African-American community organizer and anti-racism trainer, pointed out that I could call the police and expect to be protected, and that he could call the police and expect to become the object of their animosity. He knew this because he had been arrested for a crime that never even happened, let alone that he had committed. That he had been racially profiled on numerous occasions, whereas I had been let go with a friendly nod, even when it actually happened. I was driving a borrowed car in a small Kansas town late at night, had been going over the posted speed limit, and could not find the proof of registration or insurance in the car I was borrowing, and I was still let go. My friend and colleague Sarah Hayden, a communication studies professor here at UM, reminds me also that she, as a white, cisgendered, heterosexual female, also needs to learn to listen to those on the margins from her social position. For many of us in this room, that will be challenging. I've learned that I need to speak up and interrupt racism and sexism and heterosexism when it happens around me. Not because those who are the targets of oppression can't do it for themselves, but because they shouldn't have to. I need to speak up because to be silent is to agree, and because as a white guy, that's my job. I've learned from times when I didn't speak up, but also from times when I did. Like the time that a room full of white male administrators at a nonprofit I worked for in Pennsylvania decided that they wouldn't take any action on a proposal to address racism in their organization's hiring. So I sent a description of the meeting to all the people of color in the organization, informing them of what had just taken place. It led to people of color caucusing as a group and challenging the administration to make substantive changes in their policies. It also almost got me fired. Sometimes speaking up has risks. I've learned that to be a white guy with integrity and poise, I need to do my own homework. I need to learn about the history of patriarchy, racism, and sexism in this country. I need to not require women and people of color to always be in the position of having to spend their energy teaching me about myself. I've learned that being a white guy can be a real joy when I let go of the fear of getting it right, because I've gotten it wrong so many times. And I'll get it wrong again. The point is that I'm not getting it right every time. The point is that I'm in a process of getting it right more often. My colleague and friend Beth Hubble, the director of the Women, Gender, and Sexuality Studies program here at UM, pointed me to an article that differentiated between allies who see the role of an ally as a static state, one that you achieve and settle into with a kind of convoluted, self-satisfied arrogance of having arrived, and those who see the role of an ally as a process state where you acknowledge that there is always something more to learn, always new things to understand, always someplace else to go. Another story. Miles Horton was a white organizer, educator, and co-founder of the Highlander Center, an important training center for civil rights leaders ranging from Rosa Parks to Ella Baker. It's located in the mountains of Tennessee. Miles Horton also was a white man with integrity and poise, and there are so many stories that I could tell you about Horton. when confronted with a carload of angry men sent to murder him in retaliation for Horton's labor union organizing, he calmly informed the carload of men that they better get themselves organized. He said if they didn't get themselves organized, he would be able to shoot at least 2 of them before any of them got able to pull out a gun and shoot him. And he just kept talking, speaking to each man individually until finally they just got tired and drove away. I could tell you about the time that he refused to tell a group of local white people what they should do next because he believed so deeply in the need for them to decide for themselves. How they grew so angry at him for not telling them what to do that one man drew a gun and pointed it at him and threatened to shoot him if they didn't instruct them on their next step. How he refused to order them around even so, and they finally made the decision for themselves and left him alive. But what I want to point to now is what he said about fear. In an interview with Bill Moyers, Horton said this: if you don't know fear, if you're playing on the cutting edge of social change and conflict situation where the sides are lined up and there's violence all the time, you better learn to know it. We are at such a place right now. We are on the cutting edge of social change in a conflict situation where the signs are lined up and there is violence all the time. We need to know fear now. And white men like me have a particular responsibility for finding ways to reach those who are most bound by fear in this historical moment. So white men in this room tonight and those who are listening elsewhere, this is for you. I offer these words to you in front of those who are in this room with us, who love us and listen to us, who put up with us and at times grow frustrated with us. I offer these words in the hope that we can learn to do better than we've been told we can be. We can learn to be better than we have thought we can be, than what is being modeled around us by name callers and bullies and belligerents. White men, if you aim to be a white guy with integrity and poise, don't be afraid. Let go of the fear that our position of power and privilege might crumble. Know that should that happen, I am confident it would be a relief. It would be our first real opportunity to relate as equals with those around us. Don't be afraid. Be brave and speak up when we hear others demeaning women, mocking those who don't conform to our norms of white male masculinity, to those who stereotype people of color. Don't be afraid. Create new ways of being a man that are not defined by the fantasy of punching Nazis, that are based on true courage, grounded in relationships, steeped in stepping up to take the dishwasher and open it at home. Don't be afraid. Listen and listen some more and let go of the impulse to take control of the conversation. Don't be afraid. Choose to move away from assholery, douchebaggery, jerkiness, and entitlement. Speaking of the white males in his classes, my friend Felipe Hinojosa has this to add. I remind them, he said, throughout the course of a semester that the whole fucking system was set up for them and that now they have the enormous responsibility of standing alongside and in solidarity with women, people of color, and LGBTQ communities. They often ask me, Felipe said, after the semester typically, how can you do that? How can I do that? He concludes, my genius response is always the same. Just don't be an asshole. Start there. Toward the beginning of my talk, I quoted my friend Jake's observation that we white guys are blowing it in a number of ways. I haven't tried yet to say what those ways are. Here's what I think. We're blowing it by not showing just how many ways there are to be strong. Lifting weights is just one of them. And if you'd like to talk with me about CrossFit later, just come up. This is one of my son's attempts at humor. Today's lecture is on Malcolm Flex. That's me. I showed it to my students in one of my classes at one point. I said, Dr. Shearer, it's funny. It's also a little bit scary. We can also be strong by knowing when to apologize. We can be strong by resisting any situation that demeans another person. We can be strong by acknowledging where we need help. We're blowing it by cutting ourselves off from a community of people who aren't just like us, which is exactly what we do when we don't listen to women or people of color or members of the LGBT community. We're blowing it by standing in the ways of efforts to create a society that doesn't require that someone be white or male or wealthy or be born in a body where one's gender and one's sexual organs match in order to be counted as an authority and success. We're blowing it by standing in the way of history. But I'm still not sure that I've answered Jake's question. Because I know I'm not going to convince white guys that we need to get our act together by arguing on Facebook. I know that I'm not going to convince white guys that we need to stop getting in the way of history by pouring a lot of statistics and charts and data. And I know that I'm not going to convince those white guys who have been lured by the siren song of white supremacy to stop being a Nazi by punching them. I know that I'm not going to convince white guys that we need to get over our sense of entitlement by telling them our entitlement is standing in the way of us being truly human. That it's making us into a caricature of ourselves because in many instances, we have only been drawn in the pigments of privilege and power. But I do think there are three things that can make a difference. Ibram Kendi, the founder of the new Anti-Racism Center in American University, notes that self-interest is at the core of racism in our society. I would argue the same could be also true for sexism and heterosexism. The issue is going to be getting white guys like myself to recognize that it is in our self-interest to rejoin the human family and be someone at the table, not someone who needs to control the table. Once that happens, the food is going to taste better for us all. The second thing I think that can be effective comes from my study of the breaking of the first KK and the fizzling of the second. Because it suggests that we as a society have to find a way to make it costly to be a member of a white supremacy group. We did that with the Enforcement Act of 1871 that made the intimidation tactics used by the KKK into federal crimes. Essentially said, that's enough. We as a society will not stand for these racist behaviors. The challenge we face in this present moment, however, is that white supremacy is enshrined in the White House, and our law enforcement as a whole has been largely militarized. It will take a great deal of local organizing, of moving toward conflict rather than away from it, of discipline and strategizing and collectively saying no, and white guys with integrity and poise can be a part of that process. And number three, those of us who are white and men are going to need to reach out to others who are white and male and have conversation after conversation after conversation about these issues. This is what I've known to be most effective in my life. It's what I've seen to be effective in the lives of other white men. It's not glamorous work. It is hard work. It can be heartbreaking work. It takes courage and stamina and strength and vulnerability and everything that I've been talking about this evening. Two more stories to close. The first one is, well, about me. It's from a moment that defines for me one of those times that I did, I think, act like a white man with integrity and poise. The first thing you have to know about me for this story to make sense is that I really don't like conflict. I mean, as a kid, now really, wasn't I cute? Come on. I can remember coming home in tears because a teacher had yelled at another student in the classroom. I wasn't crying because the teacher had yelled at me. I was crying because there had been conflict in the classroom at all. But that's not the story I want to tell you. The story I want to tell you is from the 9 years I spent working as an anti-racism educator and organizer. During that time, I regularly served on racially integrated teams of white people and people of color and those across the gender spectrum. Together, we led intensive 3-day anti-racism workshops. During one of those workshops, we had a revolt. The group we were training, a collection of about 70 staff and volunteers, the vast majority of them white, middle class, and liberal, all worked for the organization that sponsored our training effort, a nonprofit known as Mennonite Central Committee. So we were on our home turf. Partway through the training, one member of our team was outside in the parking lot talking to about half the group who had walked out and didn't want to return, trying them to coax them back in the room. Another member of our team was in a conference room meeting with the organization's leaders, essentially deciding whether the training would be allowed to continue, and the rest of the team, myself included, were in the training space trying to proceed with some semblance of a workshop. Then we took a break. For the first 15 minutes, I and my co-trainers were swarmed by angry white participants, all of them male, who objected to our analysis of racism, opened books, and read quotes at us from texts they had brought to refute us, and claimed to represent the rest of the participants in denouncing us as manipulative, arrogant, and unsound in our thinking. So I listened, and I rephrased, and I fed back, and I de-escalated, and I did my damnedest to stay centered. Then I stepped out in the hall to eat a lemon bar and drink some iced tea. But I can remember glancing down the hallway to the exit doors at the far end of the hall. I remember wanting desperately to head straight toward them, walk through the doors, and never, ever have to talk with another white guy about racism, sexism, or any other ism. I wanted to run away. I'd been through intense conversations like these in the past, but had never had so much resistance by so many white guys all at once. So I finished eating my lemon bar, took a long drink of my iced tea. At that point, I didn't have any idea in my mind that there might be something stronger that would have helped. And I walked back into the training session. I've often thought about that moment in the hall when, lemon bar in hand, I stood and stared at those exit doors. Because of my social position, I could have left. Because of my privilege, I could have walked away and never, ever had another conversation about racism, sexism, or heterosexism ever again. But that time I didn't. I stayed in the room. It's one of those moments I will treasure because I didn't, at that moment, cash in on my privilege. I simply did my best to act with integrity and poise and stay in the game as best I knew how. I did eventually find that the limits of my effectiveness had been reached. I did eventually leave to go to grad school, but only after gathering my friends, the folks you see here, women and men, people of color and white people, gay and straight, and asked them if it was time for me to go and do something else. And they said that I should, and I agreed, and I eventually came to this place here in Montana. I am still figuring out how to be a white guy with integrity and poise. I will be for as long as the time I have before me. But I find that I like who I am becoming. I like the relationship that have continued because I didn't walk out that door. I'm glad to be a white guy who can sit at the table. So when I was working on this talk Sunday afternoon, I was struggling to know how to end it. The story I just told you didn't seem sufficient. And then at that moment, I got a message from one of my coaches at the CrossFit gym. This is not an advertisement. It is, however, I think, an example of someone, in this case a white man, who is stepping up to act with integrity and poise. This is Jesse in the gym. He is, as we say, a beast. He is also an artist and a veteran and a very good CrossFit coach. This is what Jesse wrote to me. Hey, so I have an idea/question. I'm having a hard time with all this stuff going on about kneeling during the anthem. A lot of mean things being said about players exercising their right to peacefully protest something. A lot of people on social media being terrible about it. A lot of people stating that they should stand in order to support men and women who died for this country, yet those who complain have never served themselves. I agree with the players. I think the issues in America today are getting worse by the moment. If you don't know, I am a vet. 10 years in the Army, 2 deployments to Iraq, and I will kneel and protest. I'm not sure how you feel about this, or if this is even a thing that is happening or going to happen at the university, but if you know of any Grizz players planning on kneeling during the anthem, I would like to be there with them and support them. I will even wear my dress blues. People need to stand up and fight, even if standing up means taking a knee. I want to be involved, and I figured you might be the best person to point me in the right direction, or at least talk and help me figure out a good way to get involved and how I can use my experience and voice to do something. And then he said, I am not afraid of the fallout. I've been through worse. Let me know, and thanks. What will come of Jesse's offer is in process. But the point is that this is an act of courage and poise and integrity, and regardless of what you may think about the protest movement to kneel during the national anthem, this is the very opposite of being a douchebag. So thanks, Jesse, for giving us the gift of your example. I could not have come up with a better way to end this talk. Look forward to your questions, and I want to thank the many, many people who helped make my thoughts come together. Thank you for being here this evening. And before we start accepting questions, I do want to make an announcement that one of my students, Michelle Cox, president of the Black Student Union here at U, wanted me to make, to just let you know that one option to be involved here at the university, 5:30 this coming Monday, the BSU meeting, all are welcome, at 645 South 6th Street East, and there is food and very good company. Michelle, stand up so people know they can talk to you afterwards if you want to know more.
If you have questions, I will come to you. If you just raise your hand, I'll bring the mic to you. All right. I'll be right there, Kat.
It's a long room. She'll get back as quick as she can. Hi, Kat.
Hi, Tobin. Hi, everybody else.
I can dance and they'll look at me.
Thanks. So I'm so inspired by your history of activism, and I hope to be working in that same direction. And as a senator and a women's studies student, that's what I'm trying my hardest to do this year. But I find that I keep getting burned out, and you're still doing it, and I think that's amazing. But I don't know how. How do you keep from getting burned out and continually inspire yourself to keep going?
I'll point to two things, and the one is I continue to struggle with more than the other. The one I struggle with more is just the whole idea of self-care, of knowing that it's very important to be able to put boundaries in place so that you can be around 10 years from now doing this, and not just 10 days from now. The other is the importance of community. Maybe I can put back that picture of those I worked with. You may have noticed that almost every one of those pictures includes us laughing uproariously. And that was a big part of the community we formed during the years that we were doing this together, is we spent a lot of time laughing. often was laughing over the horrific things we had to deal with, but that idea of community and fellowship and eating food together, it's just huge. Yeah, thanks for your question.
Hi, Tobin.
Hey.
So I wanted to ask, I was thinking in the last part about how I felt really touched by that story and how your friend wanted to participate. But how do we keep from like almost fetishizing like white men standing up for people of color?
Yeah. So I actually got a question from an African-American colleague of mine who he and I have done co-authoring articles together and done presenting together. And he asked me this very question. He said, how do you know those times when you as a white guy need to sit down so others can stand up? And when do you need to know that you got to be the one standing up? And for me, it's all about context. So if I'm in a situation where I know and trust the people of color I'm with, and we have had conversations about tactics, it's always clear to me when I should be sitting down and when I should be standing up, because we've talked about it. It's much more difficult for me when I'm in a situation where I don't know those in the room, but my impulse is always to take more risk as a white guy than less. And to do that in a way that I know I'm going to be accountable if I've done it in a way that draws more attention to myself than to the problem we're addressing. Because that's part of that sort of convoluted, static role that Beth pointed out to me that can develop, and that's where the fetishizing begins to emerge. It's about process. It's about relationship. It is also about tactics and when we make those decisions and when we don't. And I could go on at length about the ways in which the civil rights movement, they had those same kind of conversations. When it is do we put the white person in the front of the line? When do we need to see people of color be in positions of leadership? Very clear conversations that were going on behind the scenes to make those tactical decisions. So great question. Thank you.
Hi,
Chris.
Tobin. Hi. Along those same lines, how, as a person of color, do you talk to your friends who want you to be the spokesperson for all African Americans when they have those questions that they would be uncomfortable asking someone that they don't know? Where do you draw the line to helping to educate them, but not taking on that full responsibility of giving them knowledge?
Chris, you know I can't answer that question for you.
Come on, Tobin!
I want to, please do answer it from your own experience, because I know that's something you've dealt with.
You're not supposed to answer my question with a question. It's very hard because it's difficult to impart my wisdom from my perspective onto someone who doesn't know my perspective. It's also very daunting to try and give someone opinions that they may not fully grasp or understand from the level upon which you're viewing those things. It's also disheartening to know that the problems that they seek answers to are not worth it for them to go out and discover those answers on their own.
Right. So the thing I can add, thank you, please round of applause. That was really helpful. Thank you, Chris. The thing I can add is it's been a recurring pattern where my colleagues of color will get approached like you get approached, and they'll say, hey, you really need to go and talk with Tobin or someone like me about that. We're not going to have that conversation right now until you've had that conversation over there. And setting those boundaries has been a way that I can act as an ally and fill that role when they're being directed my way, which I've done many, many times. Yeah, thank you. Any other questions? These are great.
Hello, Tobin.
Hey, Jatan.
So there are many times where people are trying to do all they can to help out, to step up, to even take on those challenges of being exhausted and feeling like they want to give up. What do you have for more encouragement to for those people who feel like they're just exhausted and they just want to throw their hands up and say, hey, I'm done with it. I can't handle that anymore. I know you addressed it a little bit, but I wanted to go a little bit more in depth on that because I feel a lot of people are dealing with that. I know I'm dealing with that. I'm shaking right now, just even talking about it. And I'm trying to do the best I can to surround myself with people who will give that encouragement. As you said, surround yourself with good people. Make sure you have those smiles and good times. But I feel we need to address that or at least dive in a little bit deeper on that.
I'll add a couple of things. Really appreciate the question. So one of the things when we look at the long, and I'm a student of the Black freedom struggle, to look at the length of that struggle is those who have stayed in it generationally have been those who were connected back to the stories before them and brought those stories forward. That they honored the elders and the work that they'd done in the past and learned from the strength of the failures that had emerged at that time and recognized what was going to happen because of the work they were building on. I think it's also to recognize and take a longue durée view of history, knowing that there are phases and shifts in the kind of activism that emerges over time and then goes underground and comes back again. And that's going to happen again. Right now in our country today, we're in one of those points where it's bubbling up. Harry Edwards is a name I'm guessing that most of you have never heard in this room. Has anyone heard that name before? Jody, I'm glad you raised your hand. So Harry, because Jody's actually reminded me of this figure through a podcast she suggested I listen to. He was the strategist of the 1968 Mexico City demonstration of black power. You've probably all seen this image of John Carlos and Tommy Smith raising their hands in the black power salute. Harry Edwards was behind the scene helping make that happen. Guess who he was counseling in the last 2 years? And every one of you in this room know who I'm about to say. Think football, think kneeling. Colin Kaepernick is a student of Harry Edwards. Harry Edwards has been at it all that time, working behind the scenes, encouraging and being there to find the moment when this can happen again. And the biggest lesson I had to learn in the work that I've done, the small, tiny piece I've played, is that I'm playing a small, tiny piece. And what I came to responsibility is entering into the spaces where I have control over to try to be a presence that's going to make a little bit different than it was yesterday and might be tomorrow. And I can hold on to that role. I can't hold on to the role of changing it all. A couple more questions? Haven't heard from any white guys yet. Oh, there we go. All right, Nick.
So on Monday Night Football, I saw something that I'd probably never seen before, and I never thought I would have seen it, and that was a whole football team, including their owner, who is a Donald Trump supporter, kneel before the anthem. And the week before that, Donald Trump said, get those MRFers out of there.
It was SOBs, but there's been a lot of swearing in this room.
And so I just wanted to know, like, what would you say to somebody like Donald Trump has a bigger focus on this NFL thing more towards, like, over Puerto Rico, something who are, like, they're our citizens, but they're not getting any support right now. So what would you say to, like, Donald Trump? If you were, like, face-to-face with him and alone in the room, no Secret Service.
Okay, so first of all, as may be evident, I wouldn't punch him. As much as I might want to.
Maybe you would say, do you know the definition of douchebag?
So here's this. Miles Horton, who I showed the picture of earlier, one of his equally deep convictions is that your job is to work with even those people that you find most despicable on the face of this earth. So without being naive that I would walk out of that room with Donald Trump being any different than when I walked in, I would want to talk with Donald as a white man and say, hey, Donald, to quote Ruby Sales, where does it hurt? Because I think what's behind the bluster and the sexism and the insensitivity and the white supremacy is that the man is not in touch with what is hurting him. And I wouldn't back away from calling it racism and sexism or anything else. But I think Ruby Sales had it right, that that's probably the most important question to ask someone when they are in the midst of being a douchebag. Where does it hurt? Thanks, Nick. Any other questions? Let's stop there. That's a great place to stop. Is that okay, Amanda, if we wrap it up on that note?
Absolutely. Thank you, everyone, very much for coming.